Well, hello and good evening. I want to welcome you to the Marblehead Museum and to our fall lecture series. Our lecture series is sponsored by the Marble Harbor Investment Council, and we very much appreciate their sponsorship. It makes it possible for us to do this kind of lectures, which we had done in the past, but we're able to have more of them. So that's really a great thing. This evening is this is the second in our series, and the topic this evening, as you can see, is John Orne, Marblehead's first shoe manufacturer. And this will be a very interesting discussion. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, who is Standley Goodwin, who is a Marblehead historian, although that's not his only claim to fame. He's also has just recently retired from Draper Labs after a long and very distinguished career, and we're delighted that he's come to the Marblehead Museum to do some research and to work with us, and he just last month became a member of the board of directors for the Marblehead Museum, so we're delighted to have him in that capacity as well. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Standley, and we're looking forward to his lecture.
Pam?
Yes?
Did you get the lights off the screen? What you're looking at there is a pair of children's shoes, which is basically what we're going to end up talking about. Worth 12 to 16 cents a pair. Okay. John Orne was born on late September 1773, just before the Revolution. His parents were Jonathan and Priscilla Holgate Orne. Now, Jonathan Orne was a younger cousin of Asa Orne, just to put it in perspective. He was about 15 years younger than Asa, but he was a direct cousin. Jonathan's father was a brother of Asa Orne's father. So he was in the kind of the upper middle class. His wife Priscilla died, and I don't have a date, but from what I could see in the documentation, probably in childbirth, probably about 3 years after John was born. Now, in those days, a man could not raise 2 children. He needed a wife. And it was typical, if a man lost a wife, he'd marry again. There was a big surplus of women in Marblehead because of the losses at sea, and the result seemed to almost inevitably be they'd marry a young one. However, although her name was Collins, she was a Protestant. And the Collinses had been in town for quite a while. They came in the first wave of Irish immigration, which was in the late 1600s, early 1700s. Now, Mary was the only mother John ever knew. And he grew up in what was the really tough years, the Revolution and the aftermath of the Revolution. It was probably as bad as, or if not worse than, the Depression. It's the kind of thing that scars people for the rest of their lives. When you see when I give the next presentation, you'll see some of the things he did. For a person making the money he was doing, you'd wonder, why in the world is he doing this? This is the typical path for a tradesman. You went to a private school, which your father paid for, and you learned to read and write and do what they called ciphers, which was mathematics, basic add, subtract, multiply, divide. That's all you really needed for to do business in those days. That was your education. By the time you were 12, possibly 13, you were ready to go to work. You were either apprenticed, or in John's case, he went to work for his father, who was a shoemaker, and as his brother did. And he learned the trade. Now, the three Ornes, the father Jonathan, his brother Jonathan, and there wasn't any junior, and John, were shoemakers for the middle class. One of the things, now I know you can't read this, but this happens to be the first daybook page. A daybook is a book in which they put down all their transactions. And the X means it was a debt that was paid off when you see X's. This is in 1786. He's in business, clearly been in business for quite a while, probably picked up the business from his father, who died early. And some of the names are kind of interesting. You see, I know, let's see, you see Captain John Bray, Captain John Merritt, let's see, whoever, John Hooper, John Bowden. I mean, these are all names you all recognize from as Marblehead names. These were the middle class people who got their shoes and their fishing equipment from the Ornes. And they were running a business, and given that Jonathan's father, or John's grandfather, was also a shoemaker, this had gone on from probably the 1740s, that there'd been a family doing this. Surprisingly, it doesn't show in any of the histories. When he was 20, he married a 19-year-old Mary Pierce. She was 4.5 months pregnant when they got married. However, this wasn't unusual, because what mattered was marriage intentions. They usually filed marriage intentions ahead of getting married. The result being, if they'd filed marriage intentions, this was okay. And I'd say probably close to half of the women who got married were pregnant in those days. His first child was Hannah. She was born in 1794. And she was the first of 10 children, 9 of which lived to adulthood. 3 were girls, 7 were boys. One of the boys, unfortunately named Jonathan, died. They lived initially with his grandmother, Abigail, and paid rent. And this was also pretty normal. Marblehead was a very dense place at that time. There were typically, on average, 9 people living in a house. And they aren't any bigger than the houses you're looking at now. Now, being 20 years old and having a family, he had to grow up quick. He needed income. So the first you see is when he got married, he goes and works wherever he can to get credit. This is probably shoe work. It's just he gets credit for work on various days. And this helps support everything he's got going. Now, he also, soon thereafter, starting out, set up a side business in which he had his own shoe customers in addition to the ones he was working with on his father's business, so that he could have his own operation. He called it John Orne and Company. This is all handmade custom shoes for customers. If you wanted a pair of shoes, you'd go to John Orne's or go to Jonathan Orne's shop. You'd order a pair of shoes. He'd make them up for you. and you'd come and pick them up and pay for them or take them on account. This was how you got shoes in those days. For the poorer folk, they did manufacture lesser quality shoes, which was kind of low volume manufacturing. Now, in 1797, John and his father bought 37 High Street for $400. That's the house the Hamiltons lived in. Okay? I don't think 400,000 would right now have bought that house. The big event for John is that on March 26, 1803, his father died. I suspect of a heart attack because since on March 25th, he made an entry in the day book. So it wasn't a very long affair. He was working the day before he died. His older brother, Jonathan, took over the business, and 10.5 months later, his brother died. So suddenly at age 31, he's got to take over the shoemaking business, settle both the estates, and keep things going. His immediate problem was a workforce. He employed one Thomas Martin, a shoemaker. Now, Thomas Martin was what was called in those days no account, which now, this has a little different meaning than it has now, although you can see how it morphed. No account meant you couldn't get an account with the local business people. Your reputation was such you couldn't basically borrow money from them or get goods from them on promise to pay in the future. So he needed to work for somebody who could get him the supplies he needed. So John would get the supplies he needed, and Thomas would work them off. Now the Ornes had AAA+ credit, because in the shoemaking business, even in the worst of times, about 25% of his receipts were cash. So any time he needed to, when pushed, he could come up with some amount of cash. And this beat an awful lot of other businessmen who had their cash tied up, everything tied up in business and couldn't. When their money showed up, a lot of it showed up at once, but they could not, when an opportunity appeared, move very quickly because they just plain didn't have the cash. John took over, and this was a real test for a young man, taking on what he did. He took over the business, took on an employee who really worked in his own place, probably in a 10-by-10er, bought all the leather, which was quite expensive, the shoemaking supplies, and he maintained the business records. He did everything his father did. On top of that, he had to settle the estates. And his brother's wife and his mother both had interests in the business and the house. And he was, for a number of years, their source of support. By 1808, he had all the estates settled. His brother's wife was no longer living in the house, and he was basically an established shoemaker. He was now the man you went to if you were in the middle class and needed shoes. He was ready to start looking at other opportunities. He had to make periodic visits to Salem to buy leather and shoemaking supplies, and he bought large quantities of leather. He'd buy 20 or 30 sides of leather. I would not be surprised if he was supplying other shoemakers in town because of the quantities he was buying. He'd then have to hire a horse and wagon to bring the supplies in. He had room on the wagon for other things. The wagon could carry at least 1,000 pounds, and he was probably putting 500 or 600 on it. So he then went to the Salem docks and he'd buy specialty foodstuffs and liquor in volume. Oh yes. He then sold them to those who had money, and also supplied them to people who worked for them. In the beginning, not much, but when he got into manufacturing, this became basically his company store. There's his first one. The first petition, when I came across this, it was kind of interesting. First, I came across the lower one first. He's buying a hogshead of 110 gallons of rum. That would keep his family drunk for an entire year. What in the world is he up to? Well, I found the second one, and he had a license, lawyer French, got a license to sell spirits. So that was his first item in the store. He then would he'd buy casks of raisins, lemons, various things that were very difficult for the smaller store owners to get a hold of, and he did it without a middleman. So this was just one of his ventures. He also had a fishing venture too. By 1818, he was through the aftermath of the War of 1812, which in 1814 he had to resort to selling shoes to some Lynn dealers to keep his men busy. That was a pretty tough time in 1814. He then was recovered, had all the market he could take in the quality shoe business in Marblehead. There just wasn't anymore. He started looking around for other markets. Marblehead was an active port that probably had around 30 ships, mostly schooners, sailing out of it. So he'd try shipping them on vessels, usually less than a case, and try to see if he could sell them. And unfortunately, he got no profit. And this is one where he's got 6 pairs of men's shoes and 2 pairs of women's shoes, and he's sending them down east with a captain to see whether that market's got anything. There are several other receipts of this sort where he's trying other markets but not succeeding. By the mid-1820s, shoe manufacturing was starting to become a major industry in Massachusetts. It was all around. It was Brockton, Lynn, Salem, basically all around here. Various towns were starting in the shoe manufacturing. We became pretty clear that the custom shoemaking business was nearing its end. He had to get into shoe manufacturing. He and anybody else who was in the custom shoe business was in the same position. Now, manufacturing. We're not talking about something mechanized here, not lots of machinery. Real manufacturing, when you go into it, is basically breaking the process it takes to build an object into a bunch of steps. And each step typically requires a different level of skill and a different level of pay. And you assign it to different people. The system used by most of them was called the put-out system, in which they would, for instance, give either 36 or 72 pairs of basically a kit for them to assemble their step. When they were done, they'd return it to the shop and pick up another group. And they'd get paid generally with supplies. Most of them took the supplies before they did the work, like most everybody. The system basically ran on credit, and it isn't any different today. The leather itself, which was the expensive part, was cut into the pieces and was done at John's shop. a skilled leather cutter to the end of the days using leather was always a human. They mechanized everything else, but the human eye, looking for imperfections in the leather, making sure you get the maximum number of pieces out of a piece of leather. Waste, it was expensive, and waste would eat up your profit. They'd then give the uppers to women to sew. The soles were assembled and the shoes assembled on a last and then finished and delivered. This was all hand done in the 1820s and 1830s. In fact, the first machine that came along was in 1849 when the Singer sewing machine was capable of sewing uppers. And the next piece of machinery that was important was the McKay stitcher that could stitch the lasted shoe to the soles. And that didn't occur until 1859. So shoe factories, major shoe factories, did not come in until the 1860s and really came into their own in the 1870s. So for nearly half the time shoe manufacturing was done in Marblehead. It was all by hand, mostly in 10 by 10ers as subcontractors for various manufacturing operations. Now we talked about the business side, really, how he paid workers. Oops. The shoes themselves were sold in case lots, typically quantities of 200 to 500. I think a case was of children's shoes was around 300. So we're talking about a lot of shoes. Now, one of the manufacturing is what's called a cash flow business. It means you've got a lot of money coming in and a lot of money going out. And if you intend to stay in business, you better make sure that the income is greater than the outgo. And unfortunately, even today, some businesses haven't learned that lesson. To do this, you needed some kind of an accounting system. In 1824, two of his sons, Adoniram, who was 15, and Azer, who was 13, took a math course that included accounting. And this was, I believe, an evening course. And this is a page from their exercise book, and this is basically done by what's a high school sophomore. Some of the things that were in that course, I think a lot of high school sophomores today would have trouble with. I was amazed at the level of mathematics that they taught in that course. There are probably 50 pages of exercise books. This is just one, the accounting part. There was also things like doing square roots and cube roots by hand. This was, I know it was taught in April of 1824, but this gave them the skills to do accounting. Now we've talked a bit about the store and the worker doing shoe work to work it off. This was all done on an account, and this is kind of really the way today's credit system works, except you're working with a bank and a credit card system. Instead, you were working with a person. You took some supplies, and then you worked, and at some point, when the account would be settled between what you received and the work you did, and you'd get paid for the difference. Now, this wasn't a real bad deal for any of them, because John bought all of the foods, mostly food, but wood, in large quantities. He didn't have a middleman, and he paid a considerably lower price than the local stores. So both John and the worker didn't make out too badly. And this is an accounting sheet of it. The left-hand side is the things, this is just a good example. This happens to be, I've got to look to read the name. Okay. This is a Mr. Darling, who on the left is getting various supplies, and on the right is getting an accounting of his work he did. And this would have been put on a single sheet, and at some point the difference would be paid. Now, the women who sewed, all of us have the picture of Hannah binding shoes, this poor soul sitting at a window. Well, that isn't quite what it is in John's operation. He figured out how to get the middle class women to do this. And the reason you wanted the middle class women was all of them, as part of their education, were taught to sew. Those Marblehead samplers that Karen McGinnis, the curator, gave a presentation on a couple of years were done by mostly middle-class women who went to paid schools, and they were trained in their childhood how to sew and really could do a Class A job of sewing. That was part of their, serious part of their education. He could let's say, if they were having a tough spot in their family finances, they could go out and do some work and get some supplies, or if they wanted a luxury, like a cask of raisins or some lemons or possibly some liquor, they could work sewing shoes. They didn't get paid a lot, but there was no other way to make any money. Once in a while, and you'll find in here a widow who was supplementing what other income she had by sewing shoes. This was a lot better than what was available before the shoe industry came in. You didn't get paid a lot, but it sure was a lot better than nothing. Children's shoes. By 1826, there was a consignment market where basically you took your shoes to a dealer who then sold them either at auction or to specific buyers. And they existed both in Boston and Salem. John chose children's shoes for a couple of reasons. There was a demand for children's and women's shoes in Europe, and those immigrant boats that were bringing people from Europe to here didn't want to go back empty. So they're looking for cargoes going back, so the price isn't too bad for the freight to send them back to Europe. So that meant there was a demand. And John was self-financing. He didn't borrow any money to do this. The materials you needed to build a children's shoe was a lot less than you needed to build an adult shoe. So given that he had to make literally hundreds of pairs of shoes, it behooved him to start off in children's shoes. And this may have been the beginning of why Marblehead specialized, because his first products were children's shoes, and that's what Marblehead specialized in really almost to the end, children's and women's shoes. He had to really minimize his investment if he was going to do this without backing. Anyone else that didn't have the Class A credit he did was going to have a lot of trouble breaking into this business without some backers who had some money. Now here's his first sale into the Boston market, which his son William took into Boston for him and sold with one of the dealers. This is in 1826. And the quantities, 297 to one person, 333 to another, lots of numbers. However, you only got, the typical price was anywhere in the 12 to 16 cent a pair range. That may sound terrible now, but a penny was probably worth somewhere between 50 cents and a dollar in today's money. There's been that much inflation. It's very hard to say exactly what the equivalent would be, but it was not as bad as it looked. An adult shoe cost around $1.75. And there was a Salem market, J. DeLand and Company, where he also sold a fair number of shoes, typically at a little better price, but not as big quantities. He started out in 1826 at about 500 pairs a month. He was quickly, by 1828, turning out 1,000 pairs a month, month after month after month. And he also added other shoe lines. Now he was established in the business. And he sold through 3 dealers in Boston, Nestor Houghton, Otis Rich, and Guy Carlton, which I've not been able to find out much about, given how long ago it was, and J. DeLand Company in Salem. He was well known in the Boston shoe industry. In Marblehead, the custom shoe business declined pretty rapidly. He had a big business in 1824. By 1832, there was a shoe store in town. Obviously, the custom shoe business was gone. Now, John was known well enough so that one of the Boston dealers came to Marblehead. Now, coming to Marblehead from Boston was at least a 5-hour trip each way. You had to take, Boston was on a peninsula. Its only access was from Dorchester. So you had to take a ferry across to East Boston, then take the stagecoach to Marblehead, and it was a really long day trip or an overnight trip. This fellow came to, I can't read his last name, but he came to Marblehead, stopped off at John Orne's place and probably some others, and wanted to talk to him about making 2,000 pairs of shoes. And he wanted to see samples and such. It's a pretty standard business letter, very badly worded, but just the same readable. And it showed that he had a real reputation in that market. For 7 years, he ran a very complex manufacturing operation, pretty much with himself and a couple of his sons. This was very complicated. He stayed solvent. I've not found his records, let's say his accounting records, but I have to believe they existed. In early 1834, he stops manufacturing. By March, all records are gone. He just has stopped manufacturing, stopped buying large amounts of supplies. So what happened, I don't know. However, his son Adoniram, who's 26 years old, shows up as one of the major owners in what was called the Combine with Benjamin Hawks and Thomas Garney. That firm is mentioned by Sam Rhodes as one of the earliest big shoe manufacturers in Marblehead. So clearly he was 7 years ahead of the firm that's given the credit for the major shoe manufacturing in the town. As far as John, he continued making shoes by himself. He was in his 60s when he stopped the manufacturing operation. I assume he either sold it or he didn't actually own very much. He was just supplying people who had the facilities. But he, in some way, transferred the business and continued on making shoes and running other business interests that he had. A year later, a little more than a year later, his wife, Mary, died at the age 60. And in June she died. In October he married his wife's younger sister. Sound familiar? And he lived to 1850, age 77, which is not very bad for those years. So that ends the formal presentation. I'll be glad to take any questions on this. Yes.
Yeah, I was curious about the company store. You said that he was able to buy the materials at wholesale. Do you have any indication that he sold them at wholesale?
You'd see his price. He certainly made a profit on selling them, but the big problem was most of the markets, if you look under buildings, you'll see these little bitty stores. Those were the typical markets. They were all over town. They were on the first floor of many houses. They were small. A lot of the customers didn't have money for a good part of the year. So they had to mark up they carried a lot of people through the winter. So the result was they had to charge a lot more. Any other questions? Yes.
I read somewhere that the soldiers, during the Revolution, the British soldiers, there wasn't a right or a left shoe.
Yep.
Was there a right and a left shoe in?
It's hard to answer when that happened. The reason the shoes, basically, if you wore them on the same feet, would tend to take the right shape. But the operation where the shoe is shaped and put on took a wooden last. And you had to use tacks to put it into the last. And the problem was it was only good for about 50 or 60 pairs of shoes, at which point you had to make another wooden last. So they avoided left and right shoes. It's very possible that for special customers they would make two lasts, but on the standard last they just stayed with one size, and that, for the lower cost shoes, that went on into the Civil War days. It turned out that a piece of machinery made for mass-producing gun stocks was exactly what they wanted. It turned out that if you set up to make a last and changed one gear in it, you'd get the mirror image of that last. Oh, yeah. And with that machine, suddenly the left and right shoe became quite common. But initially, they made, because of the last problem, they made just one shoe, one shoe.
Was that developed in Lynn, that particular piece of?
Well, it was a government developed for making gun stocks.
Oh, okay, so
Somebody looked at it and adapted it, realized that you could make them, if you could make the mirror image on something, now I can make the left and right shoe.
Was
Yeah.
there always, did they always use a last? I mean, how far back?
Well,
was
that goes
the last?
way back. I mean, your problem was you had this sewed upper, and you had to somehow shape it
You had to.
and then attach it to the sole.
Even the small home businesses,
Oh, that was definitely where it was done.
they had to use the last.
Oh, yes. It was, you had to put something, here you had this sewed up pieces of leather, and you had to stretch it over something. I believe they wet the leather before they did it. Then you had to stretch it over a last and then attach it to the sole of the shoe. This was one of the more difficult operations and got the best pay.
The last making was also a business in its own.
Well, that was later on. In fact, it was the last step that got mechanized in the late 1870s. They developed a machine that could automatically last shoes. And that was about the last step in automation of the shoe industry. The shoe industry developed amazing between 1860 and 1880. They managed to mechanize about all of the steps of making a shoe, which meant that suddenly the skilled people were no longer needed. They would go to a place like Lynn or someplace with lots of immigrants and hire somebody as cheaply as possible, and his job was to sit there and feed the material into the machine and pull the lever. That changed the shoemaking quite a bit. Yes.
Do we know where his operation was located in town?
Do you know where the alley steps are? At the top of the alley steps, if you're facing the alley steps in Orne Street, on the right, there is a yellow house. Okay, that is the house the Hamiltons lived in, and that's where he lived in.
So he did the store and everything right out of his house?
Well, the store was probably nothing more than a shed. It really wasn't it was a place where he stored quantities and people would come to him. People generally, it was more informal in those days than it is nowadays. Most of the businesses were, you went to the fellow's shop. If you wanted something, when he was selling liquor, people would come to him and get a pint or a quart or a gallon at times. Yeah.
I was also wondering if you found any records where he hired more, it showed him hiring the fishermen who might have been off or whatever fishing trip that they were on, whatever fair they were on.
He used people year-round, so I'm assuming he used the more skilled ones. There was a business, let's say the Lynn shoe dealers used the fishermen in the winter quite a bit, and he would have had his pick of I suspect he paid better than the people making the lower quality shoes, and he would have his pick of the best ones. But,
oh, I'm sorry.
yes?
Somewhere I read that they called the Marblehead ships heel tappers because the
Yes.
men would work on leather when they weren't fishing. Is that
Well,
so?
it looked like a shoe, but it was done for a different reason. They moored on grand banks or shallow banks that always had tremendous waves, seas on them. And the boats just rolled, and they put the high stern on them, which looked like a shoe, to keep the water from coming over the stern. That was why they were done that way. These were 65-foot boats. They were out there for 2 to 3 months, and when they're on those banks, I mean, they'd roll from scupper to scupper, which means they were just rolling all the time and going up and down waves, anchored. So they picked a boat that, and if you look at the early, for instance, the early sailing ships from the 1500s, you see they have a very high bow and a very high stern. Same problem. They were typically under 100 feet, and at that length, you had to get the bow and stern up to handle the waves. As they built larger ships, it just naturally, they got up to the height where you could handle the waves. Any other questions?
So was Orne Street named after John Orne or another?
I suspect Azer. John was not almost all the Ornes that are in Marblehead are descended from John. And it's also true of almost all the Goodwins in Marblehead.
That's pretty
However,
amazing. Out of 10 children, 9 survived in
Oh, yeah.
that era. It is. That's a pretty amazing.
well, if you look, there are some families that had horrible luck,
Yeah.
and other families that would, and the one that the son he lost was 16. He very nearly, he just caught something and it, unfortunately, he didn't survive. But his wife had had somewhat of a tough life because she had a child every 2.5 years for long time. She, I think, was 42 when she last had her last child. And it was, I think, in general, the humans set up so that when you stop nursing, you can get pregnant. For most women, they don't get pregnant when they're nursing. Some do, but most don't. Supporting both a nursing child and a developing child in your body is quite a bit of a load. So, but the natural, but she had, it was amazing. It was like 2.5 years plus or minus a couple of months for every single child. And it went on from the point where she was 90 to 19 to the point she was 42. Yes?
So how long do the Ornes stay associated with shoe manufacturing or shoemaking?
They stayed in really practically to the end. Everyone, his 5 surviving sons, all were in the shoe industry. Adoniram was a well-known manufacturer and was also active in the anti-slavery movement. He had a grandson, Jonathan Hickman, who was also a shoe manufacturer, who was active just about to the end, which the industry in Marblehead basically ended with the 1888 fire. The manufacturers never rebuilt the factories after that. There were a few that survived, and it trickled on until the early 1900s, but the big industry that had been here died in, believe it or not, Christmas Eve, 1888. My great-grandfather's diary says, for that day, Marblehead in ashes. 70 houses and factories burned down.
Oh my
Unfortunately, in 1877, there was a similar fire. So there were two major fires, both of which burned down. It was 72 houses in the first fire and about 70 in the second. The second one, the town never recovered from. It turned it into a completely different town than what it was. Before that second fire, just about everybody who lived in Marblehead made their living in Marblehead. After that fire, it turned into both serving the summer people, and in a lot of cases, people worked out of town. It started the process of becoming a bedroom community, which is what it is now, versus a really business community.
Were the fires associated with shoe factories, or were they just?
They're just fires that got started. I mean, they had I think they were typically 3-story factories. They were wood. You had these leather and oils. I mean, basically, once you started a fire, they were tinder boxes. And they would go up, and there was no way of saving them. The fires went from building to building. It also burned down lots of houses. In the 1877 fire, they said all of the churches except one were on fire at one point.
The Great Salem fire started in a shoe factory also.
Well, this one happened, the first one started in a hotel. But once you start a fire in those days, they did not have the firefighting equipment that could handle it. Really, it took to the steam-powered firefighting equipment to deliver enough water and a water supply. By the 1920s, then they could control those fires. Before that, very difficult when one got going.
What areas were those 2 fires in?
Both of them were up in what we now call the center of the town. And generally, the worst of them was in the area of the Warwick, and Warwick Theater is now, and a little bit towards the high school. Oh, it burned. The first one, there was quite a southwest wind, and the embers spread all over town. Wow. So people were spending their time on the roofs, literally putting out embers to try to save their houses.
I have a comment, and one thing I just wanted, I think it's apparent when you listen to Standley and you look at what he's shown, but to show these individual examples of the documents that he worked from, this is really a sign of a good historical researcher, because this represents the individual ones that he's shown, just stacks and stacks and stacks of documents to go through and glean from that, this information that he's put together. So this is really a remarkable job, and we really appreciate it. So I wanted to thank Standley again. We would also like to invite you to come and have a glass of wine, and we'll have a chance to continue discussion. And we also have another lecture next week on the 10th. By Jay Michaud about fishing, and Jay has been a fisherman all his life, and he's going to be talking about fishing as it is today and fishing that he remembers from the past. But again, we thank Standley. This is really very interesting.